Good morning and welcome to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's guest is fiction writer Sam Lipsyte. Lipsyte's first short story collection, Venus Drive, came out in 2000 and was named one of the top 25 books of the year by the Village Voice. Since then, he's written 3 novels, The Subject Steve, Homeland, and The Ask. The latter 2 both New York Times notable books. Sam Lipsyte is a 2008 recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship, teaches creative writing at Columbia University, and he's here today on Between the Covers to talk about his new short story collection entitled The Fun Parts. Welcome to Between the Covers, Sam Lipsyte.
Thanks for having me.
So your career so far is bookended by 2 short story collections with 3 novels sandwiched in between.
Yeah.
And now you're returning to the short story form after 13 years since Venus Drive. How has it seemed different to you in coming back to it?
Well, I think that I really wanted to try a bunch of different things in this collection. Venus Drive was my first book, and the stories had very similar tones and a kind of similar momentum to them, and the characters were in pretty similar predicaments. And I just wanted to try some different approaches, try different kinds of characters, and see what the short story would be like for me now.
And do you see, coming back to the short story, does it reflect back on your growth as a writer at all, that you see changes in yourself because of it?
Well, I think I just challenged myself there. I hadn't really written with female protagonists and a close third person before, and I found that a really enlightening thing. And then playing around in some of the stories with structure was also something that excited me, and so yeah, I felt that I was expanding, but also there are some moments in the book that kind of touch back to Venus Drive, and there's even a return of a character who appeared in some of my early fiction, both in the first collection and in a novel I wrote called Homeland, a man named Gary, and so I kind of wrote a Gary story for this piece as well. So I think I was looking back, looking forward. I heard a great thing recently. A friend told me about an artist he knew who said that he would go into his studio, and most of the time he would just work on what he was working on. But sometimes he made something that he made 5 years ago, and sometimes he made something that he probably wouldn't really make until 5 years later. And so there's always that feeling of, I'm touching on new ground, and maybe that's something I'll explore more later on. And, I'm still staying connected to what I was doing and who I used to be.
Well, definitely in the fun parts, there's the Republic of Empathy, which both has the multiple points of view, but also has part of the story narrated by a predator drone, which
Yes.
which feels like a new way to go. But what you mentioned also the female protagonist, which really jumped out at me, because I think of some of your humor as being boyish and having a male sensibility about the type of humor it is, but you really pulled off the female point of view, I felt.
Thank you.
And it felt like, yes, this is identifiably a Lipsyte story, but it also felt like it had a different vibration than the other stories, both the Climber Room. And the Deniers.
Yeah.
Tell us about the experience of adopting that point of view for you. Did it come with any trepidation, or did it feel
just in the very
natural?
beginning? But I think once I started writing, I realized that women, and you don't want to generalize about women in the same way you don't want to generalize about men or anybody. So these particular women were people I felt pretty familiar with, and people. I'm not saying they were people I knew, but some of the sensibility and some of the worldview there related to a lot of women I've known in my life, and so it felt right once I was going.
One of the things that I think really makes your writing compelling is this tension, this uneasy tension between comedy and tragedy. And it also invites for different people to come away with a different feeling from each story, or maybe even the same person in a different mood. Like I think about when the first time I read Portnoy's Complaint, for instance, I thought it was just hilarious. And then coming back to it later, I found it actually to be pretty sad and dark. But it feels like that tension between those two things really allows for these multiple interpretations. So I had a question based on that for you, which is I'm reading a lot of the reviews of the fun parts, and it feels like a lot of reviewers are really pulling out things from your stories about the protagonists being losers, about the economic decline and the crappy jobs. And I wonder if part of what's going on now is what's drawing that forward into what people are noticing in your stories. Have you seen that shift with what shifts in the world outside and how people take your fiction?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. It was funny, I was reading the other night, and we did a Q&A afterward, and some guy said, well, why do you write about such pitiful people? And that really struck me because I don't consider them that pitiful. I said, well, then you're just saying that, I'm pitiful and my friends are pitiful. But I think that in general, people used to just call these kinds of characters losers, but I don't think they're real. I think the idea of all of that is changing as things have sort of changed in our society and in our economy, and now we know so many people who are struggling, and it's not a mark of your personal failure anymore. It's not a stigma. Everybody is really fighting at this point, and so that's how I've always seen my characters. As society calls them losers because they don't live up to kind of consumerist dreams of what success is and what living the right kind of life might be. And they have their problems, and they have their troubles, and they have their self-inflicted wounds. But I always see them as people trying not to surrender, or being kind of caught in a sometimes a self-delusion that they can make it this way when maybe that's not. And that's where some of the kind of crazy behavior of these characters comes from. But I do think that people are viewing some of these characters and the kinds of things that I write a bit differently now.
Yeah, I would be curious if you could do this experiment where if the fun parts had come out during the housing bubble when everyone's making money on flipping their houses, if they would have focused more on the humor, because there's so much humor in the fun parts as well. And maybe if there wasn't that collapse happening,
that anxiety,
in the economy, they would have put that in the background instead of the foreground.
It is interesting because I wrote a book when I wrote this book, Homeland. It came out in 2005. We were in the midst of the roaring times, and I think people focused more on the character in that book as being somehow on the margins, and he felt that way, and he talked about that. But I don't know if it resonated as much as it does now. The humor to me is the constant. It goes along with well, you said it yourself, tragicomic. I mean, seriocomic is a phrase that is useful. I have a hard time seeing one without the other. Everything seems pretty dark and pretty funny.
Well, in one of your interviews recently with Esquire, they asked if you could, tongue-in-cheek, distill the fun parts into a self-help motto. What would it be? And you said, fake it until you break it, at which point you own it. But it actually, I know you were probably just throwing that out there, but it does feel like a good encapsulation in a way. And it felt to me like a key to why these characters who are failing, they're courageous often, but they're also failing.
They're also making stupid decisions. I mean,
True.
I'm not setting them up as martyrs here.
Yeah, but these characters, I think, because of this "fake it until you break it" motto, that's the entryway where we can be empathetic for them. Because I at least I believe that we're all sort of muddling through, and we're all play acting in some ways our own lives, and we're watching these characters, and you've sort of taken away any of the pretense, and we're seeing that they have no idea what they're doing, essentially.
Yeah. And, nobody does, really. You can't really... I could say, well, after this interview, I'm going to go get a cup of coffee, but I don't know what's going to happen when I walk out of the studio. So it's hard to forecast, even larger things. What am I going to do with my life?
Yeah. In case you just tuned in, you're listening to Between the Covers, and we're talking today with author Sam Lipsyte about his short story collection, The Fun Parts. When we interviewed George Saunders on Between the Covers, he talked a little bit about how the cruelty of capitalism informed some of his writing, in the sense that there's no mercy if you screw up and you're in a certain situation or something, you get an illness, something happens, you may never recover. There may never be success. And I felt like that really also is something that you're confronting too. This idea of there not being a safety net, not only under your characters, but really under anybody. Even the winners in your stories, really, it feels to me like they, the winning isn't as winning as it seems.
Yeah.
Does that resonate to you?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I actually I love the way George was going on big television shows and quoting Terry Eagleton about capitalism and, killing sensuality and all of these things. I thought that was great. Yeah, I would completely agree with that. I think that's the environment within which these characters and these stories are unfolding, and you can't. I think it's a mistake to get too polemical in fiction. You can't deny the atmosphere if you want to write about people right now.
Well, I'm curious about not becoming too polemical in fiction, in the sense that you do have a lot of class issues and class anxiety and even class anger going on and brewing underneath the surface in these stories. I think of like Mitch, the male doulo, who goes into this overly curated life, and then the reverse also with the woman in the climber room who is abused basically because she's in a subservient situation. Mm-hmm. How do you deal with what I'm guessing are political concerns that you have, or even with the predator drones, for instance, and not make it into polemical fiction?
Well, I think the key is to sit down. Well, I never sit down and say, I'm now going to write a scathing story about capitalism or American foreign policy. I think that can really be a dead end. I start writing sentences, and stories and characters and voices start emerging, and then these things come up because those are among the things I think about. But I think about a lot of other things that people might find trivial that also I find really necessary for the texture of fiction and to make it an entertaining thing. So my theory has always been that what you care about will emerge as you're writing, so you don't have to worry about planning some big political assault. It's in there. It's woven in with all of the other things in the work, and I guess that's how it's operated for me. I don't think about it, and I kind of go in without some preconceived ideas. But then, and those moments sort of present themselves as you're writing the story or a novel. They take on their own logic, and you kind of are just following the logic you've created. And eventually, these moments arise.
Well, it was funny that you mentioned in another interview about the response that the Kirkus Review had to your drone piece. Could you share that with our listeners? Because I was really stunned that was a response they had.
Well, it was one of those. Kirkus does those early reviews, so it was a while ago, and the review sort of took me to task, perhaps for an overactive imagination and presenting really implausible ideas, such as a drone attacking an American on U.S. soil.
Which is hilarious now that we think about that everybody is debating this very thing.
And so I was just taken with that criticism because it really seemed obvious. I didn't think I was having some prophetic idea. I thought, I'm sure as soon as we really understood drones, why wouldn't you think about that? Why wouldn't that come into your mind? So
let's let our listeners listen to a little bit of the prose from The Fun Parts. You picked out a section you wanted to.
Sure. It's a short piece from a short bit from a story called The Republic of Empathy, which actually does have the drone as well. But I'm going to read the first section, which is narrated by a character named William. My wife wanted another baby, but I thought Philip was enough. A toddler is a lot. I couldn't picture us going through the whole ordeal again. We'd just gotten our lives back. We needed time to snuggle with them, plan their futures. But Peg really wanted another baby, said we owed Philip a brother or a sister. That seemed like a pretty huge debt. What do you do for the second child? Have a third? Peg, I said, but I had no follow-up, or was it follow-through? Peg sat at the kitchen table scribbling in the workbook she'd gotten from Arno, her German tutor. The handwriting didn't look like hers, though I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen her handwriting. This is a deal-breaker, Peg said. The deal being our marriage? Please don't leave me, she said. Who said I wanted to leave? If you refuse to have another baby, that's the same as leaving me. This is emotional blackmail, I said. The emotional aspect is implicit. You could just say blackmail. But why, Peg? This morning I smelled the top of Philip's head. The sweet baby scent is gone. Now it just smells like the top of any dummy's head. I took Philip for a walk. He tired easily, but his gait was significant. He tended to clutch his hands behind his back, like the vexed ruler of something about to disintegrate. How about a brother or a sister, I asked. How about I just pooped, Philip said. Thanks for your input. Peg always said I shouldn't model sarcasm for the boy, but who will? Everybody's so earnest around children. Besides, I've always wanted to model, to strut down the runway under all that strobe and glitter while the fashionably witty cheer on my sarcasm.
Do you read your fiction when you're writing fiction to yourself? Because there is a certain rhythmic, musical quality to, particularly when you're delivering the punchlines within your dialogue. And I was curious if that's something you sort out when you're writing through oral.
Yeah, I think possibly if you saw me writing, you might see my lips moving sometimes. But I don't do that much out loud. But I think all the time about rhythm and cadence. And so with the first draft, I'm getting it all down. But what I'm really looking forward to always is revision and more revision where I can work out those intricacies of rhythm and patterns and all of that. And that's the joy for me.
And you were a while ago. You were a student of Gordon Lish, so probably the most famous workshop leader in the United States. And you quoted something that he said to you before, which was, "Write what scares you." Yeah. What would you consider that to be for you when you're writing? What is it that scares you?
Well, he used to talk about that. He also said, put yourself in jeopardy was another way of saying it. And it took me a long time to figure out what, he meant, which was good. The point was that you needed to sit with that and figure out what that meant, because it's not ghosts and goblins, and it's not even the idea that people will find out about something bad you did or something of that sort. I think what it really ended up being for me was, what scares me is being seen in the midst of my obsession, which might be, a certain kind of paragraph and a certain way of looking at the world. And you feel vulnerable and raw when people see you seeing things and people see how you process things. And it kind of puts you out on the chopping block a little bit. And it's not really about the what, it's not, as I said before, it's not the bad thing you did or the experience necessarily. It's more about how you're bringing language to those things, and you really show who you are, and in a way that does make you vulnerable when you are pursuing things with heart and honesty, and the kind of obsession that's necessary.
We're talking today with Sam Lipsyte, the author of The Fun Parts. So when I think of Gordon Lish, I think of Raymond Carver, and I think of Raymond Carver being known so much for his efficiency and economy of language, the purity and the compression in his short stories, and then we learn how much of that was Gordon Lish when we see the Raymond Carver stories prior to him.
Yes.
What else have you taken from Lish in terms of revision and editing? You mentioned that that's really a big part of making the stories what they are. Is it similar to that process you see with the Carver stories? Even, I know you guys aren't probably very often compared to each other, Carver and Lipsyte.
No, but I think that kind of effect, especially early on and still with short stories, was a big inspiration for me. And that, yes, and especially I was always interested in writers who had both the ability to compress and the ability to move with that kind of boldness and swiftness through the prose. And then, of course, the writers that also interested me were quite funny in doing it. So someone who Lish also edited, Barry Hannah, was a big person for me. But I think if you look at the whole list of people that Lish edited, you'll find very different styles, very different approaches. Not all minimalists, But I think that another writer who may be a maximalist, Stanley Elkin, who I also read with great interest as an apprentice writer, writes these kind of extravagant pieces of prose. But I think what you'll all find with all of them is attention to language, is attention to the sentence, is the ability to listen to the acoustics you're creating.
And is there any difference in that consideration of the sentence and of language working on a 20-page short story than working on one of your novels?
I don't want there to be. And I know that some people don't like long pieces of fiction, such as novels, that are trying to do something that don't have those breaks, that don't have, and sometimes I find myself getting weak, but I try to. My goal is to manage every word in a novel the way I would in a short story, and I don't. I think we all fail on some level, but that to me that's certainly the goal.
You definitely bring in, I think, some novelistic qualities into your short fiction, and one of them being experimenting with multiple points of view, which often you will people shy away from if they have something short. But also, novels tend to allow for digression and going off into side areas, and
I'm all for that. I do that quite a bit in my.
You do that in your short fiction,
yeah.
too. And like even in the Climber Room, I feel like it meanders in a way that I actually think adds to the story, but it feels slightly different than compression to me. Interestingly, it feels
I think that
unpredictable.
There are a couple stories there that weren't trying just for pure compression, and I felt that in that story and Deniers and a couple of others where, I allow myself to riff just a tiny bit, and then try to get back into line, because you don't want to break the propulsion in a short story, but I kind of am interested in toying with the idea, I guess. So I think the reverse used to be true. I used to bring short story techniques into novels, maybe now I'm, as you say, trying out. But again, I'm trying for maybe a novel is just a longer set of similar effects. To me, I'm not sure, but I think I definitely am just trying my damnedest to pay attention to everything in whatever I'm writing.
We definitely have writers like Dickens who would do serial chapters, essentially, so have an arc like a short story and assemble them into a novel form.
Absolutely. I mean, and that they had those sections had the intensity of what we read now as short fiction.
As short stories.
Yeah.
The title of the collection, The Fun Parts, what does that mean to you?
Well, the phrase does appear in the book as a sort of dirty reference, but it's also related to the idea of books themselves. When I remember being a kid, people underlining, the good parts, the fun parts, and then as a writer and studying with people like Gordon Lish, beginning to understand, because I see this in my students. They say, well, I just have to write this boring part to get to the good part or the fun part. But I have to drop all of this information in so the reader knows all this stuff. And it's boring, but it'll be over in 10 pages, and then, the good stuff can begin. And I really am trying to get them to understand that it all has to be the good parts, the fun parts. Yeah. And so it has, and then a third meaning that sort of occurred to me when I was playing around with it as a title was the idea of, if you think of parts as a verb, the fun is sort of partying in the face of some other force.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So are you working on anything now, Sam?
Yeah, trying to work on something longer.
Can you tip your hand a little bit about what it involves?
At the moment, I wrote a page that had something to do with mental archery, but that's about all I know at this point.
Well, it's great having you on Between the Covers today.
Thank you so much.
We were talking today with fiction writer Sam Lipsyte about his newest short story collection, The Fun Parts. I'm David Naiman, your host.